It's an interesting topic to look at JRPGs of the past and what they eventually became in the present. There's no doubt there can be a divide between those who were drawn into the genre before the turn of the millennium and early 2000s, as compared to those who were drawn in come, say, the 7th generation of consoles. I've made it no secret that I got into JRPGs much later than many, during my mid-teens, so my introduction to these games were with titles like Eternal Sonata and Lost Odyssey, two gems that I still look on fondly today. If I played them now completely blind, I'm certain I'd still enjoy them. In the same breath though, it gives me a unique position to play older titles with a completely blank slate, which is what I've attempted to do in my retro series. Because of it, I've had the chance to play games like Chrono Trigger, the Xenosaga trilogy and Skies of Arcadia, with many more on the list for the future too. But because of that, it did pique my interest as to what defined an older JRPG and how that changed come the more modern releases. And it's not to say that the genre has completely moved on, even now echoes of the past remain, as there are some modern titles that embrace the old, sporting design choices that remind players of that period. I also want to mention that I'm looking at this as an all-encompassing discussion. I'm aware that there are many different styles of JRPG out there, like tactical, beat-em-up, turn-based and even visual novels, that have all gone through their own sort of trajectory to modernise their respective branches of the genre, so none of this is going to be specific per se, though I will be drawing in examples to demonstrate each of the points. Even so, it should still serve as a good foundation for something deeper should I choose to follow it up. With that then, let's go over some of the key differences, discuss them, and by all means, you can throw yours in the comments too. And let's start with one that I think is the most obvious when discussing this topic, which is quality of life. As the years have passed by, there has been a marked attempt by developers to try and minimise the frustration of players, whether that be through alleviating slower gameplay or avoiding the need of backtracking. Even within the same franchise, we can see the differences within this facet quite easily. Take Trails for instance, comparing say Trails in the Sky first chapter and Trails of Cold Steel 4. In Cold Steel 4, you generally had less of a need to grind, a lot of the potential missables and side quests were marked on the map in some way. You had a fast travel and turbo mode available for exploration and combat, something that wasn't available in the Sky trilogy and would only later be added in the PC ports. Turbo mode in particular has become a staple of the series in the present day, with pretty much every modern entry from this point expected to have it. Indeed, even games that aim to emulate the classics still have these modern additions, like Octopath Traveler or Triangle Strategy, which both have a fast mode and indeed more. But back to those features, you can save wherever you want in Cold Steel 4, there is a dedicated autosave, and there is arguably less import placed on the idea of a side system that has a heavy influence on the main offering of the gameplay. Whereas in Sky First Chapter, the augment system had far more flexibility and knowledge required in order to make combinations of quartz to get the higher level spells for later in the game. In fact, I feel this idea of important side systems can also be referenced in a recent game that got a re-release in Star Ocean Second Story R, a game that on the surface has some notable difficulty spikes, but only if you didn't engage with the skills system. A fair few players may have overlooked this feature, when in reality it was the crux that allowed a player to effectively break the game. Which brings us to the flip side of the coin. On one side, people may see the modern features as a required element for quality of life, but in the same breath, when does it become overbearing to the point that it diminishes from the experience itself? I don't think it's inaccurate to say that there's a growing sense games are becoming over-tutorialised nowadays. Heck, I've just started my playthrough of Persona 3 Reload and I couldn't believe the amount of tutorials in the opening stages for the game. I do think there's a need to explain game mechanics, especially if they are more complex than your standard templates of say turn-based combat, but there comes a point where it may feel like the game is hand-holding the player. For older games, however, it wasn't uncommon for developers to allow players to figure this stuff out themselves, either through reading the manual or engaging with the world. In fact, it was expected at times. Compare the over-tutorialization of modern games to any entry from the Saga series for instance. Shin Megami Tensei 3 or Barton Kaitos also fits this bill. Barton Kaitos in particular has a very complex system with its deck-based Magnus approach, but there are actually no in-game tutorials. Everything is taught through the NPCs themselves. If you want to understand how the game works, you need to engage with those NPCs in order to find it. Some people may feel that this is asinine, but it can't be denied that this approach does work, even in the present day. If it didn't, then games like Elden Ring or Baldur's Gate 3 wouldn't be nearly as popular as they are. There are players who like a challenge, and it might be because this approach allows players to feel accomplished with what they've done. they have figured this out themselves. They had little to no guidance, and as a result there's a sense of achievement that comes with that rather than just having it handed to you. Quest 64 for instance, despite being an older title, I remember that game just giving everything over for free. There was no currency in that game. Stay at an inn, free of charge. New equipment, free of charge. It's hard to feel any sense of accomplishment when everything is just handed over to you without a struggle. How many times do you see videos of people attempting no-hit runs against some of the hardest bosses in Souls games and the like? There is no doubt that there is a crowd of players who want challenge, and in many cases, that challenge would come from an older game that expected you to piece it together yourself, whether that be through the manuals mentioned before, or by finding secrets in the world. And that talk of the in-game world moves us over nicely to the third point, which is the difference in design philosophy between retro and modern. I feel that in the modern day, developers have aimed to adopt an approach of less is more. Now, I'm not referring to the length of the game per se, in fact many modern games on average are just wholly longer than older ones. Instead, I'm highlighting here the actual worlds themselves. Take Tales of the Abyss and Tales of Arise for instance. Tales of the Abyss had a wide open world where you move from story point to story point, with very little direction given outside of an arbitrary finger point by an NPC. It wouldn't be uncommon to end up lost trying to find the next plot point if you misplaced your bearings. In fact, I'd argue that many older games sported the open world archetype more than the modern titles. Tales of Arise though, whether it be through the desire of maintaining quality of life or hampered by higher development costs, seemed to move away from the open world formula and kept exploration reserved to pretty looking hallways with a host of diverse and memorable towns in terms of their aesthetic. No doubt Abyss had the same elements in many instances, especially in regards to the cities, but the actual ground covered between lands felt more vast in Abyss than in Arise. And maybe this is because the overall structure of JRPGs changed at a certain point. One thing I noticed as I played older titles is that they all went about their experience with a similar structure. You had some sort of overworld potentially, a story sequence, a town, and this would often be followed by some form of dungeon, rinse and repeat till the end of the game. Compare it to a modern game now that is a lot more centralised throughout, where you have some sort of home hub that you often come back to and then go out on your missions from that point. Cold Steel 1, Tokyo Mirage Sessions, Persona 5 Royal, all of them are quite similar with this approach. Even in Fire Emblem you can make this observation. Compare Radiant Dawn to, say, Fire Emblem Engage for instance. Radiant Dawn, while it didn't have an overmap, had story sequences, a town of some kind represented in a menu where you did all your equipment management, and then a battle that acted as the dungeon. Engage on the other hand had the Somnial that acted as the central hub where you could see the social events, engage in online features and all that jazz. Though not all games follow this same mould, there are certainly modern titles that adopt the old style like Dragon Quest XI, in many cases the overall structure of JRPGs appears to have changed in recent years. And that's certainly not the only thing that changed. I feel the settings themselves also started to branch out and become more realistic, and for me, I believe the older settings were more conducive to the structure of those JRPGs of the past. There was a time when Dragon Quest was the king of JRPGs. It was pretty much the mould that every other RPG made in Japan followed at that time, and some would argue that the series is still at the pinnacle of the genre. I'm not arguing that at all. But Dragon Quest was also characterised by its high fantasy setting. A chosen hero who braves the darkness and brings peace to the world, and it's largely stuck to that format for the mainline entries. As such, a lot of older JRPGs did the same. Legend of Mana, Langrisser, Lunar Silver Star Story, worlds and settings that adhered to that older structure because there was incentive and desire to explore a wholly unknown land. The structure of moving over a large map from town to town worked in those games because there was mystery and intrigue to them. No familiarity was apparent and curiosity would take over. Sure, there were exceptions to the fantasy world archetype like Phantasy Star, but the structure ultimately remained. Compare it nowadays to games like The World Ends With You or even the upcoming release of Rain Artist that are both based in modern day Tokyo. There's a sense of realism added here. The idea of high fantasy is mostly gone outside of some supernatural additions. In fact, you could look to the numbered entries of Final Fantasy and see the gradual shift in setting from those. Final Fantasy 1 to 5 were mostly high fantasy, but then it gradually moved to more neo-technical landscapes for games like Final Fantasy 6, 13 and 15, with some outliers here and there like 9 and 16 that reverted back to high fantasy. And maybe this structure changed because of a desire from developers to place more importance on the game's narrative. Maybe some sort of realistic grounding was needed to aid in conveying them. As technical limitations became less of a problem, there was less need to adhere to this idea of saving space on a cartridge. No longer was a choice having to be made between story and enemy data, for instance. No doubt, one only needs to look at the sheer volume of text in modern JRPGs to illustrate this. There is just more girth in the scripts of these games nowadays, whether that be for good or bad. Older games generally conveyed simpler stories for the most part. They could certainly still have depth, but they were often presented with less dialogue. Compare it to many modern contemporaries though, like say a Blue Reflection, where it's not uncommon for a cutscene to last for well over 5 minutes at a time, with particular import given to making sure that all characters have something to add to the conversation, as if to remind you that they're part of the scene. This idea of more involved stories once again can be seen in franchises where story isn't even a focus generally, like Ys or Atelier. Atelier, for instance, is a more character-focused series for the most part, and only recently started to embrace the idea of a more involved story in games like the Ryza trilogy and Sophie 2. Ys is the same, with Monstrum Nox even playing on the older journeys of Ad-Hoc to supplement its own story at points. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, in fact I prefer the story focus of JRPGs as it is where I get the most enjoyment. I'm just pointing out that the idea of a story in these games has seemingly now become just as important as the gameplay, in some cases even more so it can be argued. And really, this shift in focus of developers can certainly be seen in this next point. It's by no means a big one, but I always found it funny. I noticed that in a lot of older games, most notably the pioneering days of 3D, that animation for special moves was so long, as if to show off those cutting-edge graphics for the first time. Skies of Arcadia, for instance, had Vice's special move of Pirate's Wrath that took around 30 seconds to conclude. You could skip it, but only in a small window. Of course, there's the infamous Supernova of Sephiroth as well, that from memory takes 2 minutes to conclude, I believe. And then Xenosaga Episode 3 with TheKisekiNut. Busted ability, no doubt, but that took well over a minute to conclude too. I found that having an emulator came in very handy for parts like these. It did look cool for the first few times using them, not so much after the 20th. I'm not denying that modern JRPGs can have similar sequences, Trails with the S-Crafts being an example, but you can at least skip those if you want to, or smack the turbo mode on to get through it quicker. Generally speaking, the overall flow of gameplay just feels faster in modern games. And that pace between the retro and modern is the final point. Even when comparing two turn-based JRPGs, I feel a comparison can be made here to demonstrate. Take Final Fantasy Mystic Quest for instance, which has a standard menu of actions per character. You choose your action, move to the next character and keep going till the battle ends. It's traditional, no bells or whistles, and is easily identifiable for a game from that era. Persona 5 Royal on the other hand has all of its options mapped to a different button, where you choose to use the persona, the gun or just attack normally. In addition, it has the all-out mechanic to end the fight quickly if the enemy happens to be a standard trash mob. All in all, fights on average end much quicker in Persona 5 Royal than they would in say Mystic Quest, even when you look at just the control layouts at a surface level comparison. But beyond that, you have specific mechanics designed to end the fights quickly too. Pace of gameplay is intentionally rapid and is arguably needed when there is such import put on the story too. Even with that faster gameplay, Persona 5 Royal can take well over 100 hours to complete, while Mystic Quest, you're looking at a far lower runtime. And that ultimately brings us to the end of the video, where I feel like we've touched base on a fair few elements that define the retro and modern. Like I say, these aren't by any means specific, but I think as an all-encompassing approach they provide a decent foundation as to the distinctions between the two. But before we close out, I do want to mention one more thing, as I feel it can be an easily overlooked point when this topic is brought up. Though there are clear differences, and I do prefer modern games myself, there's no doubt I have enjoyed nearly all of the older games I've played in varying degrees. The most important aspect here, and I hope the main takeaway of this video, comes down to one simple point that will never disappear as the years pass by. No matter if the game is retro or modern, the success of a JRPG will always come down to one point. Is it fun to play? Do the elements within it come together in a satisfying, cohesive and engaging whole? Do the various systems play off each other to make the experience enjoyable? Is the writing of a high quality? At the end of the day, it doesn't matter to me if a game is old or new. All that really matters is, am I having fun with it? Because that trumps everything. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe for more JRPG content, and consider joining my Patreon if you're interested. Peace.